I'm Cameron Brooks, 34, a former community organizer who believed in peaceful change. 28 years, that's what the judge gave me for terrorism charges I never committed. The FBI painted me as a radical, a threat to national security, but as I sat in that courtroom, watching my life crumble, I knew the real truth they were desperate to hide. Their star witness, the man who'd orchestrated everything, wasn't just an informant, he was their creation. And protecting him meant destroying me. What I uncovered about their operation would expose a corruption so deep, it reached the highest levels of law enforcement. If you've ever wondered how far the system will go to protect its secrets, like and subscribe because this story will change how you see justice in America. The jury verdict form lay on the table before me, a simple piece of paper that had just destroyed everything I'd worked for. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed in my mind as I stared at the document that would define the rest of my life. Count 1. Conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. Count 2. Providing material support to terrorist organizations. Count 3. Conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction. I couldn't breathe. The courtroom seemed to tilt around me as the judge's voice continued, but I couldn't process the words. Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by my sister's muffled sob. My father remained silent, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. The defendant will rise for sentencing. My legs felt like lead as I stood, my public defender's hand briefly touching my arm, in what I suppose was meant to be reassurance. Judge Harrison looked down at me with the same cold expression he'd worn throughout the trial. No compassion, no uncertainty, just the mechanical delivery of justice. Mr. Brooks, you have been found guilty of planning and conspiring to commit acts of terrorism against the United States of America. The court finds these crimes to be of the most serious nature, threatening the very fabric of our democracy and the safety of innocent citizens. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I'd never planned anything more dangerous than a neighborhood cleanup day. But my lawyer had coached me to remain silent, to show respect for the court, even as it buried me alive. Taking into account the severity of these crimes and the need to protect society from future acts of terrorism, this court sentences you to 28 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. 28 years. I was 34 years old. I would be 62 when I got out if I lived that long. My mother's sob broke through the courtroom's silence, and I turned to see her face crumpled in anguish. My father held her as she shook, his own eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, and I felt the cold metal snap around my wrists. As they led me away, I caught sight of him, Marcus Stone, sitting in the gallery with a satisfied expression, the man who had called me brother, who had eaten at my table, who had sworn we were fighting for the same cause. He met my eyes for just a moment, and I saw something there that chilled me more than the judge's sentence: complete indifference. He had played his part perfectly. The concerned citizen who had tried to stop a dangerous radical, the reluctant witness who had no choice but to testify to protect his community. The prosecution had painted him as a hero, and the jury had believed every word, but I knew the truth. Marcus Stone hadn't stumbled into my life by accident. He hadn't grown concerned about my activities and contacted the FBI out of civic duty. He had been there from the beginning, pushing, prodding, leading me down a path I never would have chosen, and now, having served his purpose, he was free to disappear into whatever new identity they'd give him as the courtroom doors closed behind me. I made a promise to myself. I would survive this. I would find a way to prove what they had done to me, and someday, the truth would come out. The community center meeting flyer was still tucked in my wallet when they arrested me, a simple piece of paper announcing, "Housing Rights Workshop, know your rights as a tenant." I'd designed it myself on my laptop, printed 50 copies at the local office supply store, and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. It seemed so innocent then, so hopeful. Now I understand it was the beginning of everything. I grew up in Detroit, watching my neighborhood crumble around me. Abandoned houses dotted every block, their broken windows staring out like dead eyes. The city had given up on us, but we hadn't given up on ourselves. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep our family afloat, cleaning offices at night and watching kids during the day. My father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out, then took whatever odd jobs he could find. The injustice of it all hit me early. Why did some neighborhoods get tree-lined streets and good schools, while others got empty lots and boarded-up buildings? Why did landlords feel entitled to charge premium rent for apartments with broken heat and leaking roofs? These weren't abstract policy questions for me, they were the daily reality of everyone I loved. In college, I studied social work and community organizing. I learned about housing law, tenant rights, and the complex web of policies that kept people trapped in poverty. But more importantly, I learned that change was possible when people worked together. I saw communities that had fought back against slumlords, neighborhoods that had organized to demand better city services, and families that had achieved stability through collective action. After graduation, I moved back home with a simple mission: help my neighbors fight for the dignity and justice they deserved. I started small, helping individual families navigate the welfare system, translating documents for immigrants, connecting people with job training programs, but I quickly realized that individual solutions weren't enough. We needed to address the systemic problems that kept people down. That's when I started organizing community meetings. The first one drew 12 people to Mrs. Rodriguez's living room. We talked about the mice in the Martinez apartment, the broken streetlights on Elm Street, and the predatory check-cashing place that charged 20% to cash government assistance checks. Small problems? Maybe, but they added up to a pattern of neglect and exploitation. Within a year, our meetings had grown to fill the community center. We'd successfully pressured the city to fix the streetlights, helped 3 families get repairs from negligent landlords, and even convinced a local bank to offer free checking accounts to low-income residents. I felt like we were building something important, a community that could stand up for itself. I believed in working within the system, file the right paperwork, attend city council meetings, build coalitions with other organizations. Change was slow, but it was happening. I never advocated for violence or illegal activity. I didn't even support civil disobedience. I thought we could achieve more through legal channels. Looking back, I realized I was naive about how the system really worked. I thought if we followed the rules, if we were reasonable and respectful, we'd be left alone to do our work. I didn't understand that even peaceful organizing could be seen as a threat by people who benefited from the status quo. The surveillance started long before I noticed it. Cars that lingered too long on my street, strangers who attended our meetings but never spoke, phone calls that disconnected when I answered. At the time, I dismissed these things as coincidence or paranoia. I was just helping people understand their rights. Why would anyone want to stop that? But they were watching. They were building a file on me, documenting my activities, cataloging my relationships. They were waiting for the right moment to strike, and they were preparing the weapon. They would use against me a weapon that would walk into my life wearing a friendly smile and speaking the language of justice. Marcus Stone arrived in our neighborhood on a Tuesday in March, carrying a business card that read Community Development Consultant and a smile that seemed too perfect. I found that card in my desk drawer after my arrest, and I stared at it for hours in my cell, wondering how I'd been so blind to what was right in front of me. He introduced himself after one of our housing rights workshops, approaching me as the crowd dispersed. "Cameron Brooks, right? I've heard great things about your work here." His handshake was firm, his eye contact steady. Everything about him screamed sincerity. "I'm Marcus Stone," he said, handing me the card. "I've been doing community organizing in Chicago for the past 5 years. Just moved here to help my sister get back on her feet after her divorce. Thought I might be able to contribute to what you're building here." I should have been more suspicious. Experienced organizers don't just appear out of nowhere and immediately want to join established groups. But Marcus had done his homework. He knew about our recent victories, understood the local housing market, and could speak knowledgeably about tenant organizing strategies. When I mentioned the legal aid clinic we were trying to establish, he nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what we did in Chicago," he said. "Started small, built trust, then expanded services. I'd love to help however I can." Marcus began attending our meetings regularly, always sitting in the back, always taking notes. He contributed thoughtful questions and useful suggestions, but never tried to dominate conversations or challenge my leadership. He seemed genuinely interested in learning about our community's specific needs. After a few weeks, I invited him to coffee. We talked for hours about organizing theory, successful campaigns we'd seen, and the challenges facing urban communities. Marcus was well-read and articulate, citing authors I respected and sharing stories from his work in Chicago that sounded authentic and inspiring. "The thing that frustrates me," he said during one of our conversations, "is how slow the legal process can be. People are suffering right now, and we're asking them to wait months or years for city council to act on their concerns." I nodded, understanding the frustration. It's not perfect, but it's how lasting change happens. If we cut corners or break rules, we lose our credibility. Marcus smiled and nodded, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of disappointment. "Maybe. Of course, you're absolutely right. I guess I'm just impatient to see results." Over the following months, Marcus became a fixture in our community. He helped elderly residents navigate Social Security paperwork, drove families to court hearings, and even contributed money to help pay for supplies and meeting space. People began to trust him, to see him as one of us, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcus began pushing us toward more confrontational tactics. "What if we organized a sit-in at the Housing Authority office?" he suggested during one meeting. "Sometimes you have to make people uncomfortable to get their attention." I pushed back gently. "We've got a meeting scheduled with the director next week. Let's see what comes of that first." Marcus backed down immediately. "You're right, of course. I'm just eager to see progress." This became his pattern, proposing escalated tactics, then graciously accepting my more moderate approach. He never argued or seemed frustrated by my responses. If anything, he appeared to respect my judgment and defer to my leadership, but he kept planting seeds. "Have you ever considered that they might be monitoring our activities?" he asked one evening as we walked to our cars after a meeting. Some of the organizers in Chicago thought their phones were tapped. I laughed. Marcus, we're helping people understand their tenant rights. We're not exactly a threat to national security. Yeah, you're probably right, he said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. I just worry sometimes that we're not being taken seriously enough. Looking back, I can see how carefully Marcus was building his case. Every conversation, every suggestion, every moment of apparent friendship was calculated to serve his ultimate purpose. He was establishing himself as someone who cared about justice but might be willing to cross lines I wouldn't cross. He was positioning himself as the more radical voice in our partnership, the one who might be tempted by dangerous shortcuts, and I was helping him do it, defending the legal approach so consistently that I looked naive by comparison. I was creating the perfect contrast for the FBI's narrative, the dangerous radical and the concerned citizen trying to keep him in line, but I trusted him. Despite all my training and organizing, despite my understanding of how infiltration worked, I trusted Marcus Stone completely. He had become my closest ally in the work, the person I called when I needed to talk through strategy or vent about frustrations. He wasn't just an organizer, he was my friend. That trust would become the weapon they used to destroy me. The text message thread that would later condemn me started innocently enough. Marcus had suggested we use encrypted messaging to protect our organizing work, claiming he'd learned about digital security from his Chicago contacts. The government spies on activists all the time, he'd said. We need to be smart about this. I was reluctant at first. Our work was completely legal, what did we need to hide? But Marcus insisted it was about protecting the people we served. Immigration raids are increasing, he pointed out. If they seize our phones, they could identify undocumented families we've helped. We have a responsibility to keep them safe. That argument convinced me. I downloaded the encrypted messaging app and began using it for our most sensitive communications. The irony wasn't lost on me later. The very technology Marcus claimed would protect us became the tool they used to frame me. The messages started normally, meeting logistics, strategy, discussions, updates on various cases we were working. But, gradually, Marcus began steering our conversations toward more controversial topics. Saw another eviction notice on Maple Street today? He texted one evening, third family this month. Makes me sick how these landlords get away with it. The legal aid clinic is making progress, I replied. We should have a lawyer available to help with cases like this soon. How long will that take? Meanwhile, families are losing their homes. Sometimes I wonder if we're just putting band-aids on a broken system. I understood his frustration, but I tried to keep him focused on our long-term goals. Change takes time. We're building something sustainable here. What if we made it clear that there are consequences for predatory landlords? Maybe they'd think twice about exploiting people. The message made me uncomfortable. What kind of consequences? Nothing illegal. Just make their lives a little less comfortable. Protests at their offices? Maybe some bad publicity. Let them know the community is watching. I could live with that. Public pressure was a legitimate organizing tactic. But Marcus kept pushing. Met someone interesting today, he texted a few weeks later. Guy named Tony who's been organizing in Detroit for years. He's got some interesting ideas about direct action. I'd never heard of this Tony, and I knew most of the serious organizers in the city. What kind of direct action? Property damage? Nothing that hurts people, but maybe some broken windows to get attention. He says sometimes you have to speak their language. This crossed the line for me. That's not what we're about, Marcus. We lose all our credibility if we start breaking things. You're right, of course. I just get so angry sometimes. These people destroy lives and face no consequences. Again, he backed down immediately. But the messages kept coming, each one pushing a little further. Marcus introduced more names, people he'd supposedly met who were interested in taking things to the next level. He shared articles about successful direct action campaigns, always followed by disclaimers about how he wasn't advocating violence. The most damaging messages came after a particularly frustrating city council meeting, where our proposal for a tenant protection ordinance was tabled indefinitely. I was angry and vented to Marcus about the corruption and indifference we faced. Sometimes I feel like we're playing by rules they ignore, I typed. They lie to our faces and expect us to smile and say thank you. Exactly. The system is rigged against us. Maybe it's time to stop playing their game. What do you mean? I don't know. I'm just tired of being nice to people who don't deserve it. Maybe we need to remind them that their actions have consequences. Marcus, we can't start talking about consequences like that. It sounds like threats. I'm not talking about threats. I'm talking about justice. If the system won't hold them accountable, maybe we need to find other ways. I should have ended the conversation there. I should have recognized that Marcus was leading me somewhere dangerous. But I was angry and frustrated, and his words tapped into feelings I'd been trying to suppress. I understand the frustration, I replied. But we have to be better than them. The moment we start breaking laws, we become the villains in their story. Are we though? Or are we just people who refuse to accept injustice? The conversation continued for hours, with Marcus painting increasingly vivid pictures of a world where ordinary people fought back against systematic oppression. He never explicitly advocated for violence, but he kept pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable to discuss. Other names began appearing in our group chats. People Marcus had met who shared our frustration with the system, Tony, who had experience with property damage, Sarah, who knew about surveillance and security, Michael, who had connections with more radical groups in other cities I never met, any of these people, but their messages appeared in our encrypted threads. They spoke in code about actions and targets and sending messages. When I expressed discomfort with the direction of these conversations, Marcus would smooth things over. "They're just talking," he'd say, blowing off steam. "Nobody's actually planning anything," but the messages created a record of escalating radicalization. With Marcus carefully positioned as the voice of reason, trying to moderate my increasing extremism, the FBI had crafted a narrative where I was being pulled toward violence by mysterious radical contacts. While Marcus was the loyal friend trying to keep me on the right path, in reality, every dangerous idea, every radical contact, every suggestion of illegal activity came from Marcus himself. But the text messages told a different story, one that would convince a jury I was a terrorist in the making. And Marcus Stone was the hero who tried to stop me. The warehouse lease agreement sits in the evidence file like a smoking gun, my signature at the bottom sealing my fate. But when Marcus first suggested we needed a larger meeting space, it seemed like the natural next step in our organizing work. Our community center meetings had grown too large for Mrs. Rodriguez's living room, and we'd been struggling to find affordable space for our expanded programming. "I found the perfect place," Marcus said, spreading the lease documents across my kitchen table. "It's in the warehouse district. Cheap rent, plenty of space for meetings and workshops. We could even set up a legal aid clinic there." I looked at the address, a converted warehouse in an industrial area I wasn't familiar with. "It's kind of isolated, isn't it? People might have trouble getting there." "That's actually an advantage," Marcus replied. "More privacy for sensitive discussions. Some of the families we work with are nervous about ICE raids. They'd feel safer meeting somewhere less visible." The argument made sense, and the rent was affordable. We'd been talking about expanding our services, maybe adding job training programs or childcare during meetings. A dedicated space would allow us to do things we couldn't do in borrowed community centers. "Who's the landlord?" I asked, scanning the lease terms. "Property management company called Riverside Holdings. They specialize in flexible commercial leases for nonprofits and small businesses. Very reasonable to work with." I'd never heard of them, but Marcus seemed to have done his research. He'd even negotiated favorable terms, month-to-month lease, no security deposit, utilities included. It was almost too good to be true. "The only thing is," Marcus continued, "they need someone with established credit to sign as the primary lessee. My credit took a hit during my divorce, and I'm still rebuilding. Would you be willing to put your name on the lease?" I hesitated. Taking financial responsibility for a space I'd never seen felt risky, but Marcus had become my most trusted partner in the work, and the community desperately needed a permanent meeting space. "Can we look at it first?" I asked. "Of course." I was hoping we could go tomorrow afternoon. The warehouse was bigger than I'd expected, with concrete floors and high ceilings that made our voices echo. It was clean but sparse, with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows across the empty space. Marcus walked me through his chairs for large meetings, a corner set up for childcare, file cabinets for organizing materials. "We could put up some dividers here," he said, gesturing to the far end of the space. "Create a private office for sensitive client meetings. Maybe even add a small kitchen area for events." Despite the industrial setting, I could see the potential. The space was large enough for our growing community, and the privacy would indeed be valuable for families dealing with immigration issues or housing disputes. "What about storage?" I asked. "There's a back room perfect for supplies and equipment." The landlord even said we could install additional locks if we need extra security for sensitive files. We signed the lease that afternoon, Marcus insisted, on paying the first month's rent in cash, saying it would help establish goodwill with the property management company. I signed my name to the agreement, officially becoming responsible for a space I barely knew. Trusting a man I thought I understood. The first few weeks went smoothly. We held our regular community meetings in the warehouse, and the expanded space allowed us to accommodate more people. Marcus organized work parties to improve the space, and volunteers showed up with folding tables, chairs, and even a donated coffee machine. But then the packages started arriving. The first delivery came on a Tuesday morning when I was at my day job. Marcus called to let me know. Some supplies for the legal aid clinic arrived. He said, I signed for them and put them in the storage room. I didn't think much of it until I visited the warehouse that evening. The packages were larger than I had expected, multiple boxes stacked in the corner of the storage room. When I asked Marcus what was inside, he seemed vague. Office supplies mostly. File folders, legal forms, some reference books for the clinic. I ordered extra to get bulk pricing. More packages arrived throughout the week. Equipment for the job training program, Marcus explained. Materials for workshop handouts. Supplies for a food distribution program we'd discussed, but never formally planned. I started to feel uneasy. We hadn't budgeted for all these supplies, and Marcus kept making purchases without consulting me. When I tried to inventory what we had, Marcus was always around, offering to help but somehow steering me away from examining the contents too closely. I want to be more involved in the purchasing decisions, I told him one evening. This is moving faster than I'm comfortable with. You're absolutely right, Marcus said. I got a little carried away. I'm just excited about all the programs we can offer, but from now on, nothing gets ordered without your approval. He seemed genuinely apologetic, and I relaxed a little, but the damage was done. The warehouse was filling up with supplies and equipment I hadn't authorized, creating a paper trail that would later be used to suggest I was stockpiling materials for something far more sinister than community organizing. The final straw came when I arrived at the warehouse unexpectedly one afternoon and found Marcus deep in conversation with two men I didn't recognize. They looked up nervously when I walked in, and Marcus quickly ended the conversation. Just some volunteers interested in helping with the job training program, he explained after they left. I'm trying to recruit people with relevant skills, but something about the encounter felt wrong. The men hadn't looked like volunteers, they'd looked like people conducting business, and Marcus's explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd been preparing for this moment. That night, I lay awake thinking about the warehouse, the mysterious packages, and the strangers who seemed to know more about our operation than I did. For the first time since I'd met Marcus, I began to wonder if I really knew him at all. The warehouse that was supposed to be our community's home had become something else entirely. I just didn't realize yet that it was a trap, and I was the target. The FBI surveillance photos that would later be entered into evidence show me standing outside the warehouse at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, coffee cup in hand, keys dangling from my fingers. In the grainy black and white image, I looked like any other person arriving for work. The prosecution would later claim this photo proved I was conducting pre-operational surveillance of the target location. In reality, I was just unlocking the door to set up for a tenant rights workshop. I'd arrived early that morning because we were expecting a larger crowd than usual. Word had spread about a new wave of eviction notices in the neighborhood, and people were desperate for information about their rights. Marcus had volunteered to help set up chairs and prepare informational packets, but he'd texted the night before saying he had a family emergency and might be late. The warehouse felt different. When I walked in alone, maybe it was the early morning shadows, or maybe it was the growing unease I'd been feeling about our operation, but something felt off. The storage room door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Marcus was normally meticulous about keeping it locked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Boxers I'd never seen before were stacked along the walls, and one had been opened to reveal what looked like electronic components. Wires, circuit boards, and devices I couldn't identify were scattered across a makeshift workbench. In the corner, a duffel bag sat partially unzipped, revealing what appeared to be cylindrical objects wrapped in plastic. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to call Marcus. Before I could dial, I heard vehicles pulling up outside, multiple engines, doors slamming, heavy footsteps. My heart hammered as I realized what was happening. FBI, search warrant. The front door exploded inward, and armed agents in tactical gear flooded the warehouse. Red laser dots danced across my chest as voices shouted commands from every direction. Get on the ground. Hands where we can see them. I dropped my phone and raised my hands, my mind racing to understand what was happening. This had to be a mistake. We were a community organization. We helped people with tenant rights and immigration issues. There was nothing here that could possibly interest the FBI. Cameron Brooks, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism, conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction, and providing material support to terrorist organizations. The words didn't make sense. Weapons of mass destruction? Terrorism. I tried to speak to explain that there had been some terrible mistake, but the agents weren't interested in explanations. As they cuffed me and read me my rights, I watched them photograph everything in the warehouse. The folding chairs we'd set up for community meetings, the coffee machine donated by Mrs. Garcia, the stack of tenant rights pamphlets I'd printed at King. Through their lens, everything looked sinister, but it was the storage room that destroyed me. The agents who emerged from there were grim-faced and purposeful, carrying evidence bags filled with materials I'd never seen before. Bomb-making components? They called them timing devices. Explosive materials. Detailed plans for attacks on federal buildings. Where's your partner? One agent asked, as they led me toward the door. Partner? I was confused. If you mean Marcus Stone? He's not here. He had a family emergency. The agents exchanged glances. We'll need to speak with Mr. Stone as well. He's been cooperating with our investigation. Cooperating with their investigation? The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been late because of a family emergency. He'd been absent because he'd known this was coming. He'd been working with them all along. As they pushed me into the back of a federal vehicle, I caught sight of a surveillance van parked across the street. How long had they been watching? How many of our meetings had they recorded? How many of our private conversations had they monitored? The warehouse that was supposed to be our community's safe space had been a stage, and I'd been the unwitting star of their performance. Every meeting, Every conversation, every moment of trust had been choreographed to build their case against me. But the most devastating realization was still to come. As we drove away from the warehouse, I saw Marcus Stone standing on the sidewalk with a group of agents, looking relaxed and casual. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't being arrested. He was pointing at the building and talking animatedly like someone providing helpful information. Our eyes met for a moment through the car window. I expected to see guilt, remorse, or at least discomfort. Instead, I saw the same professional detachment I'd noticed in the courtroom months later. This wasn't personal for him. It was just work. The man I'd trusted with my life, my organization, and my community's safety had been a federal agent all along. Every moment of friendship, every shared meal, every conversation about justice and change had been a performance designed to destroy me. As the federal building came into view, I understood that my life as I'd known it was over. I was no longer Cameron Brooks, community organizer and advocate for the poor. I was Cameron Brooks, accused terrorist, and the evidence against me had been carefully constructed by the very people who were supposed to protect the innocent. The surveillance photos would show me at the warehouse, but they wouldn't show Marcus Stone placing the materials that would condemn me. They wouldn't show the federal agents who had orchestrated this entire operation. They would only show what the FBI wanted them to show, a dangerous radical who had to be stopped before he could harm innocent people. In the end, I realized that I'd been right about one thing. The system was rigged against people like me. I just hadn't understood how thoroughly or how personally until it was too late. The Miranda rights card they read to me was worn and laminated, clearly used countless times before. Agent Sarah Chen held it with practiced ease as she recited the familiar words. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The irony wasn't lost on me. These constitutional protections were about to become meaningless. The interrogation room was exactly what you'd expect from television. Fluorescent lights, concrete walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 uncomfortable chairs. Agent Chen sat across from me, her partner Agent Williams standing behind her. They had removed my handcuffs but made it clear I wasn't free to leave. Mr. Brooks, Agent Chen began, her voice professionally neutral. We know you're involved in planning terrorist attacks against federal buildings. We have surveillance footage, witness testimony, and physical evidence linking you to bomb-making materials. Your best option is to cooperate with us. I stared at her, trying to process what was happening. There's been a mistake. I'm a community organizer. I help people with tenant rights and immigration issues. I don't know anything about bombs or terrorism. Agent Williams leaned forward. We found explosive materials in a warehouse you leased. We have text messages showing you discussing attacks on government facilities. We have a witness who can testify to your radical plans. What witness? I demanded, though I already knew. The answer? Marcus Stone has been very helpful in our investigation, Agent Chen said. He's provided detailed information about your activities and your plans. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been working with them. He'd been their primary source of information about me. Every conversation, every moment of trust, every shared meal had been reported back to these agents. Marcus Stone is a liar, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Whatever he told you is false. He's the one who suggested all the radical ideas. He's the one who brought strangers to our meetings. He's the one who, Mr. Brooks, Agent Chen interrupted, we've been monitoring your communications for months. We know about your discussions of direct action, your frustration with the legal system, your talk of making people face consequences for their actions. They had been listening, the encrypted messages Marcus had convinced me to use, the private conversations about our frustrations with the city council, the moments of anger and despair I'd shared with someone I thought was my friend. All of it had been recorded and was now being used against me. Those conversations were taken out of context. I protested. I never advocated for violence. I never planned any attacks. Every radical idea came from Marcus, not me. Agent Williams smiled coldly. That's not what the evidence shows. We have recordings of you expressing anger toward city officials, discussing targets for direct action, and agreeing to escalate your activities. I want a lawyer, I said, finally remembering the advice I'd given to so many community members over the years. I'm not saying anything else without a lawyer present. The agents exchanged glances. Agent Chen leaned back in her chair. That's your right, of course, but understand that we're offering you a chance to cooperate now, while it can still help your situation. Once you lawyer up, that window closes. I knew this was a manipulation tactic, but part of me desperately wanted to explain my innocence. I don't need to cooperate because I haven't done anything wrong. Everything you think you know about me is based on lies from your informant. Mr. Stone isn't our informant, Agent Chen said. He's a concerned citizen who became aware of your radical activities and contacted us out of civic duty. He's been trying to moderate your extremist views and prevent you from harming innocent people. The rewriting of history was breathtaking. Marcus, who had pushed every radical idea, who had introduced mysterious contacts, who had filled our warehouse with materials I'd never seen, he was now the hero trying to save the community from me. That's not true, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. If they could make Marcus look like a concerned citizen, if they could twist our private conversations into evidence of terrorism, what chance did I have against their narrative? Agent Williams placed a folder on the table. These are surveillance photos of you entering and leaving the warehouse, where we found bomb-making materials. We have your signature on the lease. We have your fingerprints on equipment used to construct explosive devices. I stared at the photos. They showed me doing exactly what I'd been doing, arriving at our community meeting space, carrying coffee, looking like any other person going to work. But through their lens, these innocent actions looked sinister. I want my lawyer, I repeated, more firmly this time. Agent Chen closed the folder. We'll arrange for you to make a phone call. But think carefully about your next steps, Mr. Brooks. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your only hope is to cooperate with us and explain your side of the story. As they led me to a holding cell, I realized how carefully they'd constructed their case. They had physical evidence placing me at the scene. They had communications showing my frustration with the system. They had a witness who could testify to my supposed radicalization while appearing to be an innocent bystander. What they didn't have was the truth. But in a system where perception mattered more than reality, where a skilled prosecutor could turn legitimate community organizing into evidence of terrorism, the truth might not be enough to save me. The Miranda rights card had promised I could remain silent, but my silence had been bought with months of manufactured evidence and carefully orchestrated betrayal. By the time I understood what was happening to me, it was already too late to speak. Marcus Stone's testimony transcript runs 127 pages, and I've read every word so many times, I could recite it from memory. The document that would seal my fate was a masterpiece of controlled deception, delivered by a man who had spent months learning exactly how to destroy me. Sitting in that courtroom, watching him raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth, I felt like I was watching my own execution. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison, began with softball questions designed to establish Marcus's credibility. Yes, he had moved to Detroit to help his sister after her divorce. Yes, he had previous experience in community organizing. Yes, he had approached our group with genuine interest in helping the community. Mr. Stone, can you tell the court how you first met the defendant? Marcus's voice was steady, measured, exactly the tone you'd want from a concerned citizen. I attended one of his housing rights workshops. I was impressed by his knowledge and his passion for helping people. I introduced myself afterward and offered to volunteer. What was your initial impression of Mr. Brooks? Very positive. He seemed dedicated to helping his community through legal means. He was articulate, well-organized, and genuinely committed to making a difference. This was the setup establishing Marcus as an objective observer who had initially admired me. It made his subsequent testimony about my radicalization seem more credible. Did that impression change over time? Marcus paused, as if the memory pained him. Unfortunately, yes. Over the months I worked with him, I began to notice a growing frustration with the legal system. He started expressing anger toward city officials and landlords who he felt were ignoring our concerns. Can you give the court an example? After a particularly disappointing city council meeting, Cameron said something like, maybe it's time to stop being nice to people who don't deserve it. Maybe we need to remind them that their actions have consequences. I wanted to scream. Those were words from our private text messages, taken completely out of context. I had been venting frustration, not making threats. But Marcus delivered them as if they were clear evidence of my violent intentions. The prosecutor pressed further. Did the defendant's attitude toward legal methods of organizing change? Yes. He began expressing the view that legal channels were too slow, that people were suffering while we waited for bureaucrats to act. He started suggesting we needed to consider more direct approaches. What kind of direct approaches? Initially, he talked about property, damaged broken windows, graffiti, things that would get attention without hurting people. But his language became increasingly violent over time, lie after lie, delivered with the perfect mix of reluctance and civic duty. Marcus was painting himself as a moderate voice, trying to keep me from going off the rails, when in reality he had been the one pushing every radical idea. Mr. Stone, did you ever meet any of the defendant's associates? Yes. Cameron introduced me to several people, he said, shared our goals. People like Tony, who had experience with what Cameron called direct action. There was Sarah, who knew about surveillance and security. Michael, who claimed to have connections with radical groups in other cities. The prosecutor nodded knowingly. Did these associates express support for violence? They spoke in code, but yes. They talked about actions and targets and sending messages. When I expressed discomfort with this kind of talk, Cameron would defend them, saying they were just blowing off steam. I had defended them because Marcus had assured me they were just talking. Now he was twisting my defense of his fictional characters into evidence of my leadership of a terrorist cell. Did you ever see evidence of planning for specific attacks? Marcus lowered his voice, as if the memory disturbed him. Yes, Cameron showed me what he called research on federal buildings in Detroit. He had floor plans, security assessments, information about employee schedules. He said we needed to know our targets if we were going to make an impact. This was pure fabrication. I had never shown him any such materials because they didn't exist. But Marcus delivered the lie with such conviction that I saw several jurors leaning forward in their seats. Mr. Stone, why didn't you contact authorities earlier? I kept hoping I could talk him out of it. Cameron had been my friend, and I believed that underneath the anger, he was still a good person who wanted to help his community. I thought if I stayed close to him, I could moderate his views and prevent him from doing something terrible. The perfect answer? Marcus wasn't a government agent. He was a loyal friend trying to save me from myself. His months of surveillance and manipulation were reframed as the actions of a concerned citizen. What changed your mind? When I saw him acquiring materials that could be used to make bombs, I realized I couldn't protect him anymore. I had to protect the innocent people who might be hurt by his plans. Did you see these materials yourself? Yes. Electronic components, timing devices, chemicals that could be used to create explosives. When I asked him about them, he said they were for the next phase of our work. Another lie. Marcus had been the one acquiring those materials, probably with FBI funding, but his testimony made it sound like I had been stockpiling weapons. Well, he watched in horror. The defense attorney tried to challenge his testimony, but Marcus was too well prepared. He had answers for every question, explanations for every inconsistency. When pressed about his own suggestions of radical action, he claimed he had been trying to understand my thinking so he could better discourage me. Mr. Stone, are you receiving any consideration from the government for your testimony? No. I'm testifying because it's the right thing to do. I believe in justice, and I believe Cameron needs help, not hatred. Even in destroying me, Marcus managed to sound compassionate. He wasn't seeking revenge, he was trying to save both me and the community from the dangerous path I had chosen. As he stepped down from the witness stand, Marcus looked directly at me. For just a moment, I saw the man I had trusted, the friend I had confided in, the person I had welcomed into my home and my life. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was just another government witness who had done his job. His testimony had been flawless. A perfect blend of truth and lies that painted me as a dangerous radical while casting himself as a reluctant hero. The jury believed every word, and why wouldn't they? He had been everything they wanted in a witness, credible, sympathetic, and utterly convinced of my guilt. The transcript of his testimony would haunt me for years, not just because of the lies it contained, but because of how skillfully those lies were woven together with fragments of truth. Marcus Stone had been the perfect weapon against me, and his testimony was the perfect crime. The classified evidence motion filed by my attorney, Robert Chen, sits in the court record like a gravestone marking the death of my constitutional right to a fair trial. The document, stamped with red letters reading "Motion Denied," represents the moment when justice became impossible. Every piece of evidence that might have proven my innocence was locked away behind the shield of national security. Your Honor, my attorney had argued, we have reason to believe that crucial evidence regarding the government's investigation methods has been improperly classified. Evidence that could prove Mr. Brooks' innocence is being withheld from the defense under the guise of protecting national security. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork. Mr. Chen, the government has provided sufficient justification for protecting sensitive intelligence methods. The classification is proper, and your motion is denied. It was that simple. With a single ruling, the judge had eliminated any possibility of exposing the truth about Marcus Stone's real identity, the FBI's role in manufacturing evidence, or the systematic entrapment that had destroyed my life. The very evidence that would have freed me was deemed too dangerous for the public to know. Robert Chen was a good lawyer, experienced, dedicated, and genuinely committed to my defense. But he was fighting a rigged game with half the cards hidden from view. Every time he got close to exposing the truth, the prosecution would claim national security and the judge would shut him down. We need to subpoena Marcus Stone's employment records, Chen had told me during one of our jail meetings. If we can prove he was working for the FBI, his entire testimony becomes questionable. Can you do that? I've tried. The FBI claims that revealing information about their informant program would compromise ongoing investigations. The judge has sided with them. This became the pattern. Every crucial piece of evidence, Stone's real identity, his financial relationship with the FBI, the surveillance methods used against me, the timeline of when various materials appeared in the warehouse was classified as sensitive intelligence that couldn't be revealed without endangering national security. The witnesses who might have testified to my character and the legitimate nature of our community work began disappearing from our defense strategy. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had hosted our first meetings, was visited by immigration officials and suddenly became afraid to testify. James Martinez, who had helped organize our tenant rights workshops, received a call from his employer suggesting that association with my case might affect his job security. They're intimidating our witnesses, Chen told me after another potential character witness withdrew. I can't prove it, but people are scared to associate with your case. What about the families we helped? The people who know what our work was really about. Most of them are undocumented or have other vulnerabilities. They can't risk the exposure that comes with testifying in a federal terrorism case. The prosecution, meanwhile, seemed to have unlimited resources. They brought in experts to testify about bomb-making techniques, terrorism patterns, and the psychology of radicalization. They had FBI agents who could speak authoritatively about the threat posed by domestic terrorists. They had financial records showing payments to the warehouse, communications showing my frustration with the system, and physical evidence linking me to materials I'd never seen. The key to their case is Marcus Stone, Chen explained. If we can discredit him, everything else falls apart. But without access to his background, his relationship with the FBI, or the methods they used to develop him as a witness, we're fighting blind. We tried every legal avenue available. Chen filed motion after motion, challenging the classification of evidence, questioning the chain of custody for physical materials, demanding access to surveillance records. Each motion was carefully argued, thoroughly researched, and promptly denied. The judge's bias became increasingly obvious as the trial progressed. When the prosecution presented evidence, he listened attentively and asked clarifying questions. When the defense challenged that evidence, he seemed impatient and dismissive. His rulings consistently favored the government, and his jury instructions emphasized the seriousness of terrorism charges while downplaying the presumption of innocence. He's already decided you're guilty, Chen told me bluntly after another adverse ruling. We're not trying this case to Judge Harrison, we're trying it to the jury, and we need to hope they can see through the government's manipulation. But the jury was seeing exactly what the prosecution wanted them to see: a dangerous radical who had stockpiled bomb-making materials, a man whose private communications showed growing anger toward government officials, a terrorist plot that had been thwarted only by the courage of a concerned citizen who had risked his life to protect innocent people. What they weren't seeing was the truth about Marcus Stone. They weren't seeing the evidence of FBI manipulation. They weren't seeing the months of careful entrapment that had created the very crimes I was accused of committing. We're going to lose, Chen told me during a recess in the trial's final week. I've done everything I can, but the deck is stacked. Against us, the classified evidence, the intimidated witnesses, the judge's bias. It's too much to overcome. I had known this was coming, but hearing it from my attorney made it real. The system I had believed in, the justice I had fought for in my community, work, was nothing more than a facade. When the government wanted to destroy someone, they had the tools to do it, and the courts would help them. What happens now? I asked. We present our closing argument and hope for a miracle. But Cameron, you need to prepare yourself for the worst. They're going to convict you, and they're going to sentence you to decades in prison. The classified evidence motion lay on the table between us, a reminder of how easily constitutional rights could be swept away when they became inconvenient. The evidence that would have freed me was locked in a vault, protected by the same government that had manufactured my guilt. In the end, my defense didn't crumble. It was demolished by a system designed to protect itself at any cost. The motion to access classified evidence wasn't just denied. It was treated as if asking for a fair trial was somehow unreasonable. Even unpatriotic. Justice, I learned, was a luxury the government could afford to deny when national security was at stake. And in the post-9/11 world, everything was a matter of national security, especially the truth. The prison transport order arrived 3 hours after my sentencing. A cold bureaucratic document that authorized my transfer to a DX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. The form was filled out in neat handwriting. Brooks, Cameron, terrorist high security risk, immediate transfer required. 28 years of my life reduced to a few checkboxes on government paperwork. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. 4 hours to decide whether I would spend the next 3 decades behind bars. I had hoped the brevity might work in my favor. Perhaps they had seen through the prosecution's case. Perhaps they understood that something wasn't right about Marcus Stone's testimony. Instead, their speed reflected the opposite. They had been convinced from the beginning. The evidence seemed overwhelming, the witness credible, the defendant clearly guilty. Why waste time deliberating when the conclusion was obvious? When the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, my heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. On the count of conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of providing material support to terrorist organizations, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit me like physical blows. Each guilty verdict closed another door, eliminated another possibility for appeal, pushed me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I felt my legs give way, and only my attorney's steadying hand kept me upright. Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp cry of anguish. The sound cut through me deeper than the verdict itself. This wasn't just happening to me, I was dragging my family into hell with me. My father's quiet sobs followed, and I knew that my conviction had shattered more than just my life. Judge Harrison's voice seemed to come from far away, as he scheduled sentencing for the following week. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, and I felt the cold metal close around my wrists again. As they led me away, I caught a glimpse of the gallery. My family sat in the front row, devastated and confused. Marcus Stone sat several rows back, his expression carefully neutral, but I thought I saw satisfaction in his eyes. The media coverage was brutal. Local organizer convicted of terrorism plot, community leader planned bombing of federal buildings, terrorist sentenced to 28 years. The headlines painted me as a monster, a homegrown terrorist who had betrayed the very community I claimed to serve. The stories recycled the prosecution's narrative without question. Marcus Stone was portrayed as a hero who had risked his life to stop a dangerous plot. The FBI was praised for their diligent investigation that had prevented a catastrophic attack. I was the villain in a story of good triumphing over evil, law enforcement protecting innocent Americans from the threat of domestic terrorism. None of the articles mentioned the classified evidence that had been withheld from my defense. None questioned why so many of our witnesses had suddenly become unavailable. None examined the suspicious timing of Marcus Stone's appearance in my life or the convenient discovery of bomb-making materials in a warehouse I had leased but never fully controlled. The sentencing hearing was a formality. Judge Harrison delivered a lengthy speech about the threat of domestic terrorism and the need to send a strong message to others who might consider similar actions. He praised Marcus Stone's courage and the FBI's professionalism. He expressed no doubt about my guilt or the appropriateness of the sentence. "Mr. Brooks," he said, looking directly at me, "you have betrayed the trust of the community you claim to serve. You have threatened the safety of innocent Americans. You have attempted to use violence to achieve political goals. This court can show no mercy for such actions." I wanted to speak, to tell him that I had never threatened anyone, never planned any violence, never betrayed anyone except by trusting the wrong person. But my attorney had advised me to remain silent, to show remorse and accept the sentence without protest. "I sentence you to 28 years in federal prison, to be served in a high-security facility appropriate for convicted terrorists. You will serve a minimum of 15 years before becoming eligible for parole." The gavel fell, and my old life officially ended. I was no longer Cameron Brooks, community organizer and advocate for the poor. I was Cameron Brooks, convicted terrorist, enemy of the state, threat to national security. As the bailiff led me away, I saw my family one last time. My mother reached out toward me, tears streaming down her face. My father stood with his arm around her, his own eyes red with grief. My sister mouthed, "I love you," as the courtroom doors closed between us. The prison transport vehicle was waiting outside, a heavily armored truck designed to transport the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. As we drove away from the courthouse, I watched the city I had tried to serve disappear behind us. The neighborhoods where I had organized meetings, the families I had helped with tenant rights, the community I had dedicated my life to protecting, all of it was gone now, replaced by the sterile reality of concrete and steel that would define my existence for the next 28 years. The transport order in my file would ensure that I was treated as a high-security risk, kept in isolation from other prisoners, monitored constantly for signs of continued terrorist activity. The document that authorized my transfer also authorized my burial in the deepest hole the federal prison system could provide. But even as the courthouse faded from view, I made another promise to myself. I would survive this. I would use every day of my sentence to uncover the truth about what had been done to me. And someday, somehow, I would expose the conspiracy that had destroyed my life. The transport order might have sealed my fate, but it couldn't touch my determination to prove my innocence. The real fight was just beginning. The letter from my mother arrived 3 weeks after I entered ADX Florence, written on the floral stationery she had used for special occasions my entire life. The familiar handwriting and the scent of her perfume that still clung to the paper became my lifeline to a world that felt increasingly distant and unreal. "My dearest Cameron," it began, "I hope this letter finds you safe and strong. We think about you every day and pray that you are holding on to hope. Your father planted tomatoes in the backyard garden, the ones you always said were your favorite. When they're ready, I'll make that sauce you love and pretend you're here to share it with us." Prison life at ADX Florence was designed to break the human spirit. My cell was 7 by 12 feet, with a concrete bed, a steel toilet, and a narrow window that showed only a slice of sky. I spent 23 hours a day in that box, with 1 hour for exercise in a slightly larger concrete box they called the recreation yard. The guards treated me like I was one step away from building a bomb in my cell. Every interaction was monitored, recorded, and analyzed for signs of continued terrorist activity. I couldn't receive books without approval, couldn't make phone calls without surveillance, couldn't even write letters without having them read and censored by security staff. But it was the other prisoners who posed the most immediate threat to my survival. In a place filled with the most violent criminals in the federal system, being labeled a terrorist carried a special kind of danger. Some inmates saw me as a hero for standing up to the government. Others saw me as a target, someone whose death would earn them respect and protection. My first week, a lifer named Rodriguez cornered me in the shower area. "I hear you like to blow things up," he said, pressing a makeshift blade against my ribs. "Maybe I should blow you up before you hurt any more innocent people." I had seconds to decide how to respond. Show fear, and I'd be a victim for the rest of my sentence. Fight back, and I might not survive the encounter. Instead, I looked him in the eye and told him the truth. I never hurt anyone, I said quietly. I'm here because the FBI needed someone to blame for their informant's crimes. If you're going to kill me for something I didn't do, at least know what you're killing me for. Something in my voice must have convinced him. Rodriguez studied my face for a long moment, then stepped back. You better hope you're telling the truth, he said, because if I find out you're lying, this conversation is going to have a very different ending. Word spread quickly through the prison about my claim of innocence. Most inmates were skeptically everyone in prison claimed to be innocent. But a few listened, and gradually I found allies among the men who understood what it meant to be betrayed by the system they had once trusted. Carlos Mendez became my closest friend inside. He was serving life for a drug conspiracy that had been manufactured by an undercover agent who had pressured him into dealing. The FBI loves to create criminals, he told me during one of our conversations in the yard. Easier than catching real ones. Through Carlos I learned about other cases like mine, men who had been entrapped by informants, prosecuted with manufactured evidence, and sentenced to decades in prison for crimes that existed only in the imagination of federal agents seeking to justify their budgets and advance their careers. You want to survive in here, Carlos advised. You need to stay busy, learn something, study something, keep your mind sharp. The moment you start feeling sorry for yourself is the moment you die inside. I took his advice. I requested access to the law library and began studying legal research techniques. I learned about Freedom of Information Act requests, about appellate procedures, about the complex web of regulations that govern federal investigations. If I was going to prove my innocence, I needed to understand the system that had convicted me. My mother's letters kept me anchored to hope. She wrote about the garden, about neighbors who asked about me, about the small victories and daily struggles of life in our old neighborhood. She never mentioned the media coverage or the way people looked at her when they recognized her as the terrorist's mother. She focused on love, on family, on the future we would share when I came home. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by yesterday, one letter read. She wanted me to tell you that the Tenant Rights Clinic is still meeting every Tuesday. They're using the materials you developed, and they've helped 3 families avoid eviction this month. Your work is still making a difference, even if you can't be there to see it. These connections to my former life sustained me through the darkest moments of adjustment to prison, when the isolation felt unbearable, when the violence seemed overwhelming, when the injustice of my situation threatened to drive me to despair. I would read my mother's letters, and remember that somewhere beyond these walls, people still believed in the work I had done, but the letters also reminded me of everything I had lost. The community I had served was moving on without me. The families I had helped were facing new challenges I couldn't address. The work I had dedicated my life to was continuing, but I was no longer part of it. Prison was supposed to be punishment, but the real cruelty wasn't the concrete walls or the constant surveillance. It was the knowledge that while I rotted in a cell for crimes I hadn't committed, the real criminals, the FBI agents who had orchestrated my downfall, the prosecutors who had hidden evidence, the informant who had destroyed my life, were free to continue their work. My mother's letter that week ended with the same words she had used to close every letter since my arrest. We love you. We believe in you, and we're waiting for you to come home. Stay strong, my brave boy. The truth will set you free. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in my small collection of personal items. The truth would set me free, but first I had to find it, and that meant surviving long enough to uncover the conspiracy that had put me here. In a place designed to destroy hope. My mother's letters were proof that love could survive even the most determined efforts to crush it. They were my reminder that somewhere beyond these walls people were still fighting for justice, and that someday I would join them again. The Freedom of Information Act request form was a simple piece of paper, but it represented my first real weapon against the system that had buried me. Carlos had helped me understand the process during our conversations in the yard. FOIA is how you make them show their cards, he had explained. They'll fight you every step of the way, but eventually they have to give you something. I had been in prison for 8 months when I filed my first request, asking for any FBI documents related to my investigation. I expected delays, denials, and heavily redacted pages. What I didn't expect was the explosive revelation that would arrive 6 months later in a manila envelope marked FOIA response, partial release. The package contained 847 pages of documents, most of them so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art painted in black ink, but scattered throughout the blacked out text were fragments of information that began to piece together a picture I had never imagined. The surveillance had started 18 months before my arrest, long before I had met Marcus Stone, long before I had any contact with anyone the FBI could remotely consider suspicious. They had been watching me since the very beginning of my community organizing work, cataloging my activities, mapping my relationships, and waiting for an opportunity to strike. One document, dated 3 months before Marcus appeared in my life, contained a chilling recommendation. Subject demonstrates potential for radicalization through manipulation of his frustration with systemic inequalities. Recommend introduction of suitable operative to guide subject toward actionable criminal conspiracy. They hadn't been investigating me because I was a terrorist. They had been investigating me because they thought they could turn me into one. Most devastating revelation came in a personnel file for UC-2847, an undercover operative whose real name was redacted, but whose description matched Marcus Stone perfectly. The file detailed his previous assignments, his success rate in developing criminal cases, and the financial incentives he received for each conviction. Marcus wasn't just an FBI informant, he was a professional provocateur, a specialist in creating the very crimes he was paid to prevent. His job was to identify potential targets, gain their trust, and guide them toward activities that could be prosecuted as terrorism. My case wasn't his first hit, was number 17 in a career built on manufacturing criminals. The documents revealed the systematic nature of the operation against me. They had studied my psychology, my relationships, my vulnerabilities. They knew about my mother's health problems, my father's financial struggles, my dedication to my community. They had used all of this information to craft Marcus Stone's approach. Subject responds positively to appeals to justice and community protection. One psychological profile noted. Recommend operative present as fellow organizer with shared values but greater willingness to escalate tactics. Reading these documents felt like watching a master manipulator dissect my soul. Every conversation I'd had with Marcus, every moment of trust, every shared meal had been choreographed by federal agents, who saw me not as a human being but as a target to be developed and destroyed. The financial records were equally damning. Marcus had been paid $2,500 per month as a base salary, plus bonuses for significant developments in the case. His final payment of $50,000 had been authorized the day after my conviction, a success bonus for a job well done. But the most shocking discovery was a memo discussing the warehouse lease. The FBI hadn't just known about the space they had arranged for it. Riverside Holdings, the property management company that had offered such favorable terms, was a front operation run by federal agents. The warehouse had been selected specifically because it was isolated, easily monitored, and perfect for staging the discovery of bomb-making materials. Every aspect of my case had been orchestrated. The location, the evidence, the witnesses, even the lawyer who had initially contacted me about representing my case, everything had been designed to ensure my conviction. The documents also revealed something else that chilled me to the bone. I wasn't the only target. The FBI's domestic radicalization program had been active in dozens of cities, creating cases against community organizers, activists, and anyone whose work challenged the status quo. Young Muslims had been particularly targeted, but the program had expanded to include environmentalists, immigration advocates, and civil rights organizers. We were part of a systematic campaign to criminalize dissent by manufacturing the very crimes the FBI claimed to be preventing. The war on terror had become a war on anyone who dared to organize for change. I spent hours studying each document, looking for patterns, connections, and contradictions that might help my case. The more I learned, the more I understood the scope of what had been done to me. This wasn't prosecutorial misconduct or a few rogue agents. This was official policy, carried out with the full knowledge and approval of FBI leadership. The breakthrough came when I found a reference to ongoing surveillance of subjects' communications via SIGINT cooperation. The acronym meant Signals Intelligence Electronic Surveillance that went far beyond what had been admitted at trial. They hadn't just been monitoring my phone calls and text messages. They had been intercepting everything: emails, internet, searches, even the metadata from my social media activity. This evidence should have been disclosed to my defense attorney. The fact that it hadn't been was a clear violation of my constitutional rights. But more importantly, it meant there were recordings and transcripts of conversations that would prove Marcus had been pushing every radical idea. Not me. I immediately began drafting letters to civil rights organizations, journalists, and lawyers who specialized in government misconduct cases. The FOIA documents were the smoking gun I needed to prove my innocence. But I needed help from people with resources and expertise to use them effectively. The first breakthrough had arrived in the form of a simple government document, heavily redacted but containing enough truth to crack open the conspiracy that had destroyed my life. After 8 months of despair and isolation, I finally had hope that justice might still be possible, but I also understood that possessing the evidence was only the beginning. The same system that had manufactured my guilt would fight viciously to prevent the truth from being exposed. The real battle was just starting, and I was fighting it from inside a concrete box where my every move was monitored by the people I was trying to expose. Still, for the first time since my arrest, I felt like Cameron Brooks, the organizer, rather than Cameron Brooks, the convict. I had work to do, a case to build, and a truth to tell. The FOIA request had given me my first real weapon, and I intended to use it. The FBI personnel file that arrived in my second FOIA request was partially redacted, but enough information remained visible to identify Agent Sarah Chen as Marcus Stone's handler. the document that would become crucial to proving the conspiracy against me revealed a career built on manufactured terrorism cases and a pattern of prosecutorial advancement through entrapment operations. Chen's file showed a meteoric rise through the FBI hierarchy that coincided perfectly with terrorism convictions. She had started as a junior agent in the Detroit field office 7 years before my arrest. Within 18 months, she had been promoted to senior agent. 2 years later, she became a supervisory special agent. By the time of my trial, she was being considered for assistant special agent in charge of the entire counterterrorism division. Each promotion corresponded with a successful terrorism prosecution. The Malik case in 2018, a young Muslim engineering student who had been convinced by an informant to research bomb-making techniques. The Rodriguez matter in 2019, an environmental activist who had been manipulated into discussing attacks on logging equipment. The Thompson investigation in 2020, an Iraq War veteran struggling with PTSD, who had been guided toward planning an attack on a federal building. The pattern was unmistakable. Chen specialized in identifying vulnerable individuals who could be developed into terrorism cases. She didn't catch terrorists, she created them. The financial incentive structure was laid out in bureaucratic detail. Each successful terrorism conviction earned Chen performance bonuses, priority consideration for promotion, and increased authority within the bureau. My case alone had resulted in a $25,000 performance award and her recommendation for promotion to the counterterrorism division's leadership team. But the most damaging information in Chen's file was the documentation of her relationship with Marcus Stone. The records showed that Stone had been working as an FBI asset for over 8 years, participating in 17 different cases across multiple states. His success rate was remarkably a 94% conviction rate for targets he was assigned to develop. Chen had recruited Stone during his own arrest for financial fraud in Chicago. Instead of facing federal charges that could have resulted in decades in prison, Stone had agreed to become an FBI asset. His criminal skills, his ability to gain trust, manipulate emotions, and create convincing false identities made him perfect for undercover work. The financial arrangement was more extensive than I had initially understood. Beyond his monthly salary and conviction bonuses, Stone received housing allowances, healthcare benefits, and even a pension plan. The FBI had essentially created a full-time position for manufacturing criminal cases, and Stone was their star employee. Most disturbing were the training records that showed how thoroughly Stone had been prepared for my case. He had attended workshops on community organizing, studied local housing law, and even taken courses in social psychology to better understand how to manipulate activists and advocates. The FBI had spent months crafting Marcus Stone's identity before he ever appeared at my community meeting. They had researched my background, my psychological profile, and my vulnerabilities. They had designed Stone's approach specifically to appeal to my desire for justice and my frustration with slow legal processes. Chen's performance evaluations contained chilling details about the methodology used against me. Agents successfully identified subjects, emotional triggers, and guided asset to exploit them effectively. One review noted, subjects' isolation from potential criminal contacts required creation of fictional radical network to provide apparent escalation pathway. They had known from the beginning that I had no connections to actual criminals or terrorists, so they had created fictional ones, the mysterious Tony, Sarah, and Michael who had appeared in our text message chains. These people had never existed except as FBI creations designed to make me appear to be part of a larger conspiracy. The warehouse operation was documented in meticulous detail. Chen had personally supervised the placement of bomb-making materials, the installation of surveillance equipment, and the timing of the raid. She had coordinated with federal prosecutors to ensure that the evidence would be discovered in a way that appeared coincidental rather than orchestrated. Even Marcus's testimony had been scripted. The personnel file contained drafts of his court testimony, with notes from Chen about how to present information for maximum impact. They had rehearsed his answers, anticipated my attorney's questions, and prepared responses that would deflect any suggestion of impropriety. Asset demonstrated excellent courtroom presence and maintained cover throughout testimony. Chen's post-trial evaluation noted, subject's conviction obtained with minimal exposure of operational methods. The file also revealed the broader scope of Chen's operations. She was running similar cases in 3 other cities, with different assets targeting different types of activists, environmental groups, immigration advocates, civil rights organizers. Anyone whose work challenged government policies was potentially vulnerable to her entrapment schemes. My case had been her masterpiece. the conviction that would secure her promotion to division leadership. I wasn't just a victim of prosecutorial misconduct. I was a career-building achievement for an agent who had turned the manufacture of terrorism cases into a lucrative specialty. But the most valuable information in Chun's file was evidence of her direct communication with prosecutors about hiding evidence from my defense team. Internal memos showed that she had personally recommended classifying crucial evidence as national security sensitive to prevent my attorney from accessing it. Disclosure of assets, identity, and operational methods would compromise ongoing investigations. One memo read, "Recommend classification of all materials related to subject development and evidence placement." This was proof of a conspiracy between law enforcement and prosecutors to deny me a fair trial. Chen hadn't just manufactured evidence against me, she had actively worked to prevent my defense team from exposing her methods. The personnel file was more than just evidence of misconduct. It was a roadmap showing how the FBI had corrupted the justice system to create the appearance of successful counterterrorism operations. Chen's career advancement was built on the lives she had destroyed, the innocent people she had imprisoned, and the constitutional rights she had trampled. Reading her file felt like staring into the face of institutional evil, not the dramatic villainy of movies, but the banal, bureaucratic evil of career advancement through human destruction. Chen had turned the manufacture of injustice into a performance metric, and my 28-year sentence was just another line item on her resume. But now, I had her number. The personnel file was evidence that even the FBI's classification system couldn't completely hide. With Chen's identity confirmed and her methods documented, I finally had a target for my legal counterattack. The student was about to become the teacher, and Agent Sarah Chen was going to learn what it felt like to have her life examined under a microscope by someone who understood exactly how the system worked. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between the pages of a legal journal that had been delivered to my cell. The envelope bore no return address, no postmark, and the handwriting was deliberately disguised. But the words inside would change everything. "You're not the only victim. Some of us still believe in justice." The letter was brief, typed on plain paper with no identifying marks, but the information it contained was explosive details about the FBI's domestic radicalization program that could only have come from someone inside the bureau. "Agent Chen's operation extends far beyond your case." The letter read, "There are currently active investigations in 12 cities using similar methods. The program is called Operation Domestic Shield, and it has manufactured over 2 terrorism cases in the past 5 years. You were victim number 847. The writer claimed to be an FBI employee who had become disgusted with the Bureau's methods. They had been following my case since my conviction and had been waiting for an opportunity to provide information that might help expose the truth. "I cannot reveal my identity," the letter continued, "as it would end my career and possibly my life, but I can provide documents that prove what was done to you. The question is whether you're prepared to use them responsibly." My hands shook as I read those words. After 2 years in prison, after countless nights wondering if I would ever be able to prove my innocence, someone was offering me the evidence I needed, but they were also warning me about the dangers of pursuing the truth. The letter included specific details about my case that had never been made public. The writer knew about Chen's performance bonuses, about the manufactured evidence, about the coordination between the FBI and prosecutors to hide crucial information from my defense team. They also knew about other cases, names, dates, and methods that formed a pattern of systematic abuse. The Riverside Holdings warehouse wasn't the first property the FBI has used for evidence staging, the letter revealed. There are at least 6 other locations in different cities where similar operations have been conducted. The Bureau has essentially created an infrastructure for manufacturing terrorism cases. The anonymous source also provided insight into the internal politics driving these operations. Post-9/11's counterterrorism funding had created powerful incentives for agents to produce results, even if those results had to be manufactured. Career advancement, budget allocations, and political influence all depended on maintaining high conviction rates in terrorism cases. Agent Chen is not a rogue operative, the letter explained. She is following official policy designed to justify massive counterterrorism expenditures. Your conviction helps secure $50 million in additional funding for domestic surveillance programs. The writer also revealed something that chilled me to the bone. The FBI knew about other informants who had been exposed in similar cases, and those informants had a disturbing tendency to disappear or die in suspicious circumstances. Marcus Stone had been relocated and given a new identity after my trial, but he wasn't safe. He was a liability who knew too much about FBI operations. The Bureau has a policy of protecting assets only as long as they remain useful, the letter warned. Once they become security risks, they are eliminated through various means. Stone should be careful about his continued health. The anonymous source offered to provide more detailed documentation, but only if I could demonstrate that I had legitimate legal representation and a realistic plan for exposing the truth. They were willing to risk their career and safety but not for a futile gesture that would only result in more victims. I have copies of internal memos, financial records, and operational plans that would destroy this program, they wrote. But I need to know that someone with resources and expertise will use them effectively. Too many innocent people have already been sacrificed to advance careers and justify budgets. The letter ended with specific instructions for making contact. I was to place a classified ad in the Detroit Free Press using coded language that would signal my readiness to proceed. The writer would then provide additional information through a series of dead drops and intermediaries designed to protect their identity. Reading that letter was like being offered salvation and damnation simultaneously. The evidence I needed to prove my innocence was within reach, but obtaining it would require me to put someone else at risk. The anonymous source was willing to sacrifice their career and possibly their life to help expose the truth, but only if I could guarantee that their sacrifice would matter. I spent the next week agonizing over the decision. Did I have the right to ask someone else to risk everything for my freedom? Could I guarantee that the evidence would be used effectively? Was I prepared to take on the full power of the federal government in a battle that could destroy more lives than it saved? But then I thought about the other victims, the 200 people who had been manufactured into criminals by Agent Chen's program. One thought about the families destroyed, the communities terrorized, and the justice system corrupted by these operations. I thought about the future victims who would be created if the program continued unchallenged. The decision became clear. This wasn't just about my innocence anymore. It was about stopping a systematic corruption of everything I had once believed about American justice. The anonymous source was offering me a chance to expose the truth, and I had a responsibility to take that chance, regardless of the personal cost. I began drafting a response to the classified ad, using the coded language specified in the letter. The message was simple: seeking information about property management opportunities in Detroit area, serious inquiries only, references available. The ad would run for 3 days, signaling my willingness to proceed with the dangerous partnership the anonymous source was offering. I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return, moving from victim to active participant in a conspiracy to expose government corruption. The letter from my anonymous ally sat hidden beneath my mattress, its words memorized and its implications terrifying. Someone inside the FBI had decided that the truth was more important than their career, their safety, or their future. The least I could do was prove them right. The revolution against my oppressors was about to begin, launched not with violence or dramatic gestures, but with a simple classified ad that would signal my readiness to fight back against the system that had tried to bury me alive. The evidence compilation folder that would eventually vindicate me started as a simple manila envelope, but over the course of 3 years it grew into a comprehensive archive of government corruption. Every document, every communication, every piece of evidence I gathered was carefully organized in a makeshift filing system I created in my Cella collection that would ultimately expose the most systematic abuse of civil rights in modern American history. Building a case from inside, federal prison presented challenges I had never imagined. Every phone call was monitored, every letter was read, every visitor was screened. The FBI knew I was gathering evidence against them, and they used their surveillance capabilities to monitor my progress and anticipate my moves. But I had allies now, both inside and outside the system. The anonymous FBI source had provided a roadmap for my investigation, pointing me toward specific documents, cases, and individuals who could corroborate my claims. Through carefully coded messages and dead drops, they fed me information that no prisoner should have been able to access. My first breakthrough came through the legal mail system. Correspondence with attorneys was supposed to be privileged, but I knew the FBI was finding ways to monitor even those communications. So I developed a network of lawyers, civil rights organizations, and journalists who could serve as intermediaries for sensitive information. Sarah Martinez, a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union, became my primary contact with the outside world. She had been following wrongful conviction cases for years and immediately understood the significance of what I was uncovering. Through her, I was able to coordinate with other victims of FBI entrapment operations. Your case fits a pattern we've been tracking, she told me during one of our legal visits. We've identified at least 40 similar cases in the past 5 years, all involving FBI informants who push targets toward criminal activity. But your documentation is the most complete we've seen. Working with Martinez, I began reaching out. 2 other wrongfully convicted individuals who had been victims of Agent Chen's operations: Marcus Khalil, a college student in Chicago, who had been manipulated into researching bomb-making techniques; Jennifer Washington, an environmental activist in Portland, who had been convinced to plan attacks on logging equipment; David Kim, a veteran in Seattle who had been guided toward targeting federal buildings. Each of these cases followed the same pattern: vulnerable individuals identified by FBI analysts, professional informants deployed to gain their trust, systematic manipulation toward criminal activity, and prosecutions that relied on hidden evidence and classified materials. Chen had refined her methods with each case. learning from experience how to better manufacture convictions. The appeals process for my own case had been a series of devastating defeats. Every motion was denied, every argument rejected, every piece of new evidence dismissed as insufficient to overturn the conviction. The system seemed designed to prevent wrongfully convicted individuals from proving their innocence, especially in terrorism cases where national security concerns trumped constitutional rights, but the broader investigation was yielding results. Martinez and her team had filed Freedom of Information Act requests for dozens of related cases, slowly building a database of FBI misconduct that extended far beyond my situation. Each new document revealed additional evidence of the systematic nature of the entrapment program. The media attention came slowly at first. A few independent journalists began investigating the pattern of cases we had identified, but mainstream outlets were reluctant to challenge FBI terrorism prosecutions. The post-9/11's climate made it politically dangerous to question counterterrorism operations, even when those operations appeared to be manufacturing the very crimes they claimed to prevent. Everything changed when Marcus Stone surfaced unexpectedly in Portland, Oregon, operating under a new identity but using the same methods he had perfected in my case. A local activist named Rebecca Torres recognized his manipulation techniques from articles about my case and contacted the ACLU for the first time. We had a current target who understood what was happening to her. Torres agreed to work with FBI investigators while secretly recording her interactions with Stone. The recordings she produced were devastating clear evidence of Stone pushing her toward criminal activity while positioned himself as a voice of moderation. When the FBI attempted to arrest Torres for terrorism charges, the ACLU was ready with evidence that the entire operation had been orchestrated by their own informant. The Portland case became a national scandal. Stone's identity was exposed. His connection to my case was revealed. And suddenly mainstream media outlets were paying attention to the pattern of FBI misconduct we had been documenting. The story had everything journalists wanted: government corruption, innocent victims, and a clear narrative of abuse of power. Senator Elizabeth Warren called for congressional hearings. The New York Times ran a front-page investigation into FBI entrapment operations. 60 Minutes produced a documentary about wrongful terrorism convictions. Suddenly, my case was no longer an isolated incident but part of a national conversation about civil rights and government accountability. But success brought new dangers. My anonymous FBI source sent urgent warnings that the Bureau was conducting internal investigations to identify the whistleblower. They had narrowed their suspects to a handful of agents with access to the classified information that had been leaked. My contact might be forced to disappear or risk exposure and prosecution. The prison administration also increased their surveillance and harassment. My phone privileges were restricted, my mail was delayed, and my access to legal materials was limited. They claimed these measures were necessary for security reasons, but it was clear they were trying to interfere with my ability to continue building the case against the FBI. They're scared, Martinez told me during one of our visits. The evidence you've gathered is causing real problems for them. Congressional committees are asking questions. Inspector generals are launching investigations. And career FBI officials are starting to distance themselves from the entrapment program. After 3 years of methodical investigation, my evidence compilation folder had become a comprehensive indictment of government corruption. Financial records showing payments to informants, operational memos detailing entrapment methods, surveillance records proving illegal monitoring, and internal communications revealing the coordination between agents and prosecutors to hide evidence from defense attorneys. The folder represented more than just my path to freedom. It was a roadmap for reforming a system that had lost its way in the pursuit of manufactured victories over imaginary threats. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Operation Domestic Shield. But the real test would come when we finally had our day in court. Building the case had taken years, but proving it would require confronting the full power of the federal government in a legal battle that would determine not just my fate, but the future of civil rights in America. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was complete, and the public was finally paying attention. After years of patient work from inside a concrete cell, I was ready to fight back against the system that had tried to bury me alive. The Court of Appeals decision that would finally acknowledge the prosecutorial misconduct in my case arrived on a gray December morning, 12 years after my conviction. The 23-page ruling, signed by a unanimous 3-judge panel, contained words I had dreamed of reading for over a decade. The government's conduct in this case represents a fundamental violation of due process that strikes at the heart of our constitutional system. Judge Patricia Williams, writing for the court, didn't mince words in her condemnation of the FBI's methods. The evidence presented demonstrates a systematic program of entrapment designed not to prevent terrorism, but to manufacture it. The defendant was not a terrorist who was caught. He was an innocent man who was created into a criminal through government manipulation. The decision came after a year of explosive revelations that had finally forced the justice system to confront the truth about Operation Domestic Shield. The breakthrough had started with Rebecca Torres's case in Portland, where the exposure of Marcus Stone had created a domino effect of investigations, exposures, and congressional hearings. Media coverage had been relentless. The Washington Post's investigation into FBI entrapment operations had won a Pulitzer Prize. The New York Times had published a 7-part series documenting the systematic abuse of civil rights in counterterrorism cases. 60 Minutes had produced 3 separate documentaries about wrongful terrorism convictions, with my case featured prominently in each one. But the real turning point had come when Agent Sarah Chen was called to testify before the House Judiciary Committee. Under oath and facing perjury charges if she lied, Chen had been forced to admit the scope of her operations. The television coverage of her testimony had been devastating. A federal agent admitting to manufacturing terrorism cases for career advancement. Did you know that Mr. Brooks had no connections to actual terrorists when you initiated the investigation? Congressman Gerald Nadler had asked. Yes, Chen had replied, her voice barely audible. Did you instruct your informant to introduce radical ideas and criminal suggestions to Mr. Brooks? That was part of the operational plan. Did you personally oversee the placement of bomb-making materials in the warehouse that Mr. Brooks had? Lise Chen had paused for nearly 30 seconds before answering. Yes, I did. The admission had sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. For the first time, a federal agent had publicly acknowledged manufacturing evidence in a terrorism case. The implications extended far beyond my situation to hundreds of other cases that had relied on similar methods. Marcus Stone had also been compelled to testify, though his appearance had been even more dramatic. After years of hiding under federal protection, Stone had been located by investigative journalists and served with a congressional subpoena. His testimony had confirmed every detail of the conspiracy against me. I was paid to befriend Mr. Brooks and guide him toward criminal activity. Stone had testified. Everything I did was at the direction of Agent Chen and the FBI. Mr. Brooks never expressed interest in violence until I suggested it. He never had access to bomb-making materials until I provided them. He was not a terrorist, he was my target. The congressional hearings had also revealed the scope of Operation Domestic Shield. Over 200 cases in 43 states, targeting activists, immigrants, veterans, and anyone whose political activities were deemed problematic by federal authorities. The program had consumed over $800 million in taxpayer funds. While creating the very crimes it claimed to prevent, public pressure had mounted for accountability. Victim advocacy groups had organized protests outside federal buildings. Civil rights organizations had filed class action lawsuits seeking compensation for wrongfully convicted individuals. Religious leaders had denounced the targeting of Muslim Americans. Even some conservative politicians had criticized the abuse of government power. The pressure had finally forced the Justice Department to conduct its own internal investigation. The Inspector General's report, released 6 months before my appeals court decision, had been scathing in its criticism of FBI methods. The report had recommended criminal prosecution of agents involved in the most egregious cases, including Chen and her supervisors. But it was Agent Chen's forced testimony that had provided the final piece of evidence needed for my appeal. Under congressional questioning, she had admitted to personally recommending that crucial evidence be classified to prevent my defense team from accessing it. This was clear prosecutorial misconduct that violated my constitutional right to a fair trial. I made the recommendation to classify certain operational details, Chen had testified. I believed it was necessary to protect ongoing investigations. Did you know that this classification would prevent Mr. Brooks's attorney from challenging the evidence against his client? I understood that might be a consequence. Did you discuss this strategy with federal prosecutors? Yes, we coordinated to ensure that sensitive materials would not be disclosed. The admission of coordination between law enforcement and prosecutors to hide evidence from the defense was exactly what my legal team needed to prove constitutional violations. The appeals court had no choice but to acknowledge that my conviction had been obtained through fundamentally unfair methods. The decision overturning my conviction was comprehensive and damning. The court found that the FBI had violated my Fourth Amendment rights through illegal surveillance, my Fifth Amendment rights through the use of manufactured evidence, and my Sixth Amendment rights by denying me access to materials necessary for my defense. The government's conduct in this case was so outrageous that it violates due process, Judge Williams wrote. No civilized system of justice can tolerate the manufacture of crimes by those sworn to prevent them. The defendant's conviction must be vacated, and all charges against him must be dismissed with prejudice. The ruling also included language that would help other victims of similar operations. The court established new precedents for challenging informant testimony, accessing classified evidence in criminal cases, and holding government agents accountable for misconduct. Future defendants would have legal tools that I had been denied. But, perhaps most importantly, the decision included a scathing indictment of the entire Operation Domestic Shield program. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates a systematic abuse of government power that has no place in a constitutional democracy, the court concluded. We call upon the executive branch to immediately terminate these operations and the legislative branch to provide oversight to ensure they are never resumed. Reading the decision in my cell, I felt a mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication that the truth had finally been acknowledged. Grief for the 12 years of my life that had been stolen. The court could overturn my conviction, but it couldn't restore the time I had lost, the relationships that had been destroyed, or the community work that had been interrupted. Still, the decision represented more than personal vindication. It was an acknowledgement that the system could still be forced to confront its own corruption when enough pressure was applied. Truth could still prevail, justice could still be achieved, and government accountability was still possible in America. Court of Appeals decision that freed me also freed the truth about Operation Domestic Shield. After years of hidden operations and manufactured cases, the systematic abuse of civil rights had finally been exposed and condemned by the highest levels of the federal judiciary. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The truth had emerged, and with it, the possibility of preventing future victims from suffering the fate that had been imposed on me. The exoneration certificate arrived 3 days before my release. An official document declaring my innocence and ordering my immediate freedom after 12 years of wrongful imprisonment. The simple piece of paper, signed by federal Judge Patricia Williams and bearing the official seal of the United States District Court, represented more than just my vindication. It was acknowledgement that the system could still be forced to confront its own corruption. I held the certificate with trembling hands as the prison chaplain read the order aloud in my cell. The court hereby finds that Cameron Brooks was wrongfully convicted of terrorism. Charges based on manufactured evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. All charges are dismissed with prejudice, and the defendant is ordered released immediately, with a full acknowledgement of his innocence. 12 years. 4,380 days of my life stolen by people who had sworn an oath to protect and serve. But as I packed my few possessions into a cardboard box, I felt no bitterness, only determination to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else. The walk from my cell to the prison gates felt surreal, like emerging from a nightmare into a world I barely recognized. My mother waited outside the fence, aged by grief and hope, her arms outstretched as if she could pull me back into the life I had lost. My father stood beside her, tears streaming down his face. Unable to speak, my sister held a sign that read, "Welcome home, Cameron," in the same handwriting she had used for school projects decades earlier. The media circus was overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions about my plans, my feelings, my intentions regarding the people who had destroyed my life. I had prepared a statement with my legal team, but standing there in the sunlight for the first time in over a decade, all I could think about was my mother's embrace, and the possibility of sleeping in a bed without steel bars surrounding it. I bear no hatred for the individuals who wronged me, I told the cameras, reading from notes I had written the night before. But I am committed to ensuring that the system that enabled this injustice is reformed so that no other innocent person suffers what I have endured. The financial settlement with the federal government had been finalized weeks before my release. $8.7 million, approximately $730,000 for each year of my wrongful imprisonment. The money could never compensate for what I had lost, but it would provide the resources needed to continue the fight for justice reform. Agent Sarah Chen had resigned from the FBI under pressure, facing potential criminal charges for perjury and civil rights violations. Marcus Stone had disappeared again, relocated by federal marshals after receiving death threats from families of other victims. The systematic dismantling of Operation Domestic Shield was ongoing, with dozens of cases under review and several agents facing prosecution, but my focus was on the future, not the past. Within a month of my release, I had established the Cameron Brooks Foundation for Justice Reform, dedicated to supporting wrongfully convicted individuals and exposing prosecutorial misconduct. Sarah Martinez left the ACLU to become the foundation's executive director, bringing years of experience in civil rights litigation. Our first major initiative was a comprehensive database of questionable terrorism convictions, identifying cases that showed patterns similar to mine. We had documented over 300 potentially wrongful convictions, with dozens already being reviewed by appellate courts based on evidence we had developed. The foundation also provided legal support for victims of government entrapment, helping them access resources for appeals and civil litigation. We had assembled a team of attorneys, investigators, and experts who specialized in exposing manufactured criminal cases, but perhaps most importantly, we were working to change the laws that had enabled my persecution. Federal legislation introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren would require disclosure of all informant relationships, limit the use of classified evidence in criminal trials, and create independent oversight of counterterrorism operations. The Cameron Brooks Justice Reform Act had bipartisan support and was expected to pass both houses of Congress within the year. The law would create new protections for defendants in terrorism cases and establish penalties for agents who manufactured evidence or violated constitutional rights. My relationship with my family was slowly healing, though 12 years of separation had created wounds that would take time to mend. My mother fussed over my health and weight, cooking every meal I had missed during my imprisonment. My father, who had aged dramatically during my incarceration, seemed afraid to believe that I was really home to stay. The community I had served before my arrest welcomed me back with a mixture of celebration and grief. The Tenant Rights Clinic was still operating, run by volunteers who had kept my programs alive during my imprisonment. The families I had helped remembered me, and new families were seeking assistance with problems that had only gotten worse during the years I was gone. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 80s, invited me for dinner on my second week home. "Mijo," she said, using the affectionate term she had called me years earlier, "we never stopped believing in you. We knew you were innocent because we knew your heart." The warehouse where I had been framed was now a community center, purchased by the foundation and converted into a legal aid clinic and organizing space. The irony was intentional, transforming the site of my persecution into a place where others could seek justice. Standing in that space during our grand opening ceremony, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. From community organizer, to convicted terrorist, to exonerated activist, my path had been shaped by both injustice and the determination to overcome it. The exoneration certificate hung framed on the wall of my office, a reminder of how close I had come to spending my entire life in prison for crimes I never committed. But it was also proof that truth could prevail when enough people were willing to fight for it. During my remarks at the ceremony, I looked out at an audience that included former cellmates, civil rights lawyers, investigative journalists, and congressional representatives. 12 years ago, I was arrested in this building on charges I never committed. I said, "Today, we're opening a center that will help ensure no one else suffers that fate." The fight for justice reform would continue for years, maybe decades. There were hundreds of wrongfully convicted individuals still in prison, thousands of families destroyed by prosecutorial misconduct, and a system that remained vulnerable to abuse by those who prioritized career advancement over constitutional rights. But progress was being made. Laws were being changed, agents were being prosecuted, and victims were being vindicated. The foundation had already helped secure the release of 17 wrongfully convicted individuals, with dozens more cases in progress. As I locked the community center that evening and walked home through the neighborhood I had once organized, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a decade: hope for the future. Not just my future, but the future of justice in America. The exoneration certificate had declared my innocence, but it had also declared something more important: that accountability was still possible, that truth could still matter, and that ordinary people could still force their government to confront its own corruption. My story began with betrayal and injustice, but it was ending with redemption and purpose. The system that had tried to destroy me had ultimately made me stronger, more determined, and better equipped to fight for others who faced similar persecution. If you've watched this story and found yourself wondering how many other innocent people are sitting in prison cells tonight, wondering if anyone will fight for their freedom, then you understand why this work matters. Subscribe to our channel, share this story, and join us in demanding a justice system that actually serves justice, because the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the cost of justice is never giving up on the truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge.